it's organizations like the Alliance for Audited Media that allow us to operate with integrity and with ethics and self-police so that the government doesn't have to step in with regulations regarding advertising and marketing. So it's good people like Philip and Ted and Joan who put the thinking forward. Ted is the chairman. I believe, Philip, you are the co-chair of Canada, and you are the VP General Manager for Canada, correct?
Correct.
You are chairman overall? North American? Yeah, very good. So it's a global organization? All right. So, Joan, I'm going to let you tell the group a little bit more to open up, and then take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you, Derek. And hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out today and spending some time with us. We really appreciate it. The Alliance for Audited Media has been around for a long time, over 100 years, and we work with publishers, advertisers, and agencies. We're tripartite, not-for-profit organization. We are really a data company. Our product is auditing, so we're the world's largest circulation database. And we work with our clients to come up with trusted and accountable, transparent solutions. And we're kind of the conduit between the seller and the buyer, and that's our role. So we're governed by a board of experts, and we have a few of those in the room today that I just want to give a shout out to. Sarah Trimble from St. Joe's, Ann Myers from the Myers Consulting Group, and of course the two gentlemen beside me. So starting with Philip. Philip is a publisher and CEO of the Globe and Mail. Philip oversees strategy and operations for the Globe and Mail newspaper, for its websites, including theglobeandmail.com, reportonbusiness.com, and globeinvestor.com, and magazines, including Report on Business. For more than 2 decades, Philip has guided the Globe and Mail through intense newspaper competition and led the organization to successful leadership in new media and online products, while maintaining high standards for editorial and production quality. The Globe and Mail and its staff continually win numerous national newspaper awards. Just this year, nominated for 17 national newspaper awards, and awards in other areas like digital, business reporting, graphics, design. The list is long. Philip joined the AAM North American Board, which Ted is chair of, in 2006, and was elected chairman of the AAM Canada Board in 2016. Thank you for coming out, Philip.
Thank you.
Ted Boyd is CEO of global mobile on-demand marketplace Magnify, a leading destination for knowledge workers and entrepreneurs in the freelance economy, and he is CEO of ad marketing agency Current International Inc. We call Ted a serial entrepreneur with more than 2 decades as well of executive leadership in the digital marketing and technology sectors. He has held executive positions in numerous agencies and marketing organizations. Early in Ted's career, and I hate to say it, Ted, it was early, it was quite a while ago, he served as Senior VP New Media Technologies and New Business at Young & Rubicam, where he founded their digital practice in 1996. And I think, Moira, you put up an ad from 1994, right? So digital has been around for a long time. In 1997, Ted served as the founding president of the Interactive Advertising Bureau, IAB. And Ted was elected chair of the AAM board in 2016. Warm welcome to you both. Thank you. And let's get started. So for the past 25 years, digital innovations have continually changed the media landscape. We all know that. Ted, you've been around and involved as a digital marketer for a very long time, as we discussed, more than 2 years. Could you share a little bit of what you've seen, what you're seeing, and for the future maybe even too, a little bit?
Thanks, Joan. Great to be here with you and Philip. Thank you, Derek, as well, and your team. More great session before ours. Well done. Very enjoyable. When I started as employee number 1 of Young & Rubicam Canada's digital group in 1996, to Joan's point, there was a lot of talk about content being king. And I think we still hear that, but In 1996, I was invited to go over to Edinburgh and present a paper on interactive television, which was, very early in the development of that as well. And there was a professor who lectured that day, the day that I made my presentation, and talked about connectivity being king. And, that's had a profound influence in my thinking, at least, in terms of how networks of networks impact content and the importance of having humans at the end of those networks. And if one looks at the development of the internet as an advertising medium over the past 20 years, much of what even Maura talked about earlier, many of the challenges we have relate to the fact that these networks are often at the end not attached to humans. Just as a statistic for interest discussion today, there are 15 million websites on Earth taking advertising dollars, and there are approximately 1 million websites that are frequented by humans on a regular basis. Those numbers are staggering, and that gives you some sense of the scale of the problem that we face as an industry. Looking at innovation and disruption, or thinking about disruption and innovation, to come back to the topic of our session today, it's hard to really think about disruption without thinking about Google and Facebook. And particularly in the context of Canada and advertising dollars, I think it just bears serious thought. And I don't think foundationally we as a nation are really thinking through the cost of the dollars in the advertising ecosystem that are leaving this country, and they're not therefore being able to be reinvested into organizations like the Globe and Mail and their properties and many others in this country, Canadian news, and foundationally how that impacts our democracy. And it really is foundationally about democracy. And we'll talk a bit more about that as we get into the session. And finally, I think, just as a principle, as an agency over the years, we've always tried to work with wonderful content with great connections to humans, like the Globe and Mail does, but also really trying to think through environment. And Maura touched on this as well. Audience is about environment. Audience is not a standalone concept. And this notion of buying audience as a standalone concept, I think, has led the industry into places that aren't necessarily good. The value of environment, to Sarah's question earlier, is extremely high. And I think that as we sort this out from an industry point of view, environment will become far more, not less important. Thank you.
Okay. Moira, you also talked a little bit about marketers focusing on reaching the right consumer, the right time, and the right place. And I think that there's probably an assumption that when they're reaching that consumer, it's in a quality environment. And for 175 years, the Globe and Mail has offered readers understanding of issues that matter to Canadians to help them shape their views and their decisions. Recognized as a news media trendsetter, Phillip, with investment in quality journalism and journalism that matters, which is one of your taglines, which I love, and a focus on data. We talked about data earlier and the importance of it, understanding and building subscriber relationships, leadership events, native advertising, and so on. Will you share some of the strategies that your organization has put in place to address this?
Sure, thank you. I was at a dinner, swanky dinner, in New York on Monday night, and a guy came up to me who, his name is Ronald Lauder. I don't know him, but he's one of the family behind Estee Lauder. He said, I read the Globe and Mail every day, which is surprising given that he lives in the U.S. But he says, no, it's one of the best things to read in North America, and I like reading it because it's not all about Donald Trump. So there you start. The New York Times, as a leading publication in North America, has lost some credibility in recent years because it is described by too many people as the official opposition to Donald Trump. So the criticism of the New York Times, fair or not, is that it has lost its objectivity because of its relentless criticism of Donald Trump. It does a lot of very good journalism, but there's a credibility question for the New York Times. As we come and look at what people are making of democracy, and it's a big issue for our government. Our Prime Minister's in Paris today for various cool meetings, but I think one of them is about tech for good. One of them is about the Christchurch call as to what should happen with social media platforms that allow some of the atrocities to be shown that were shown after the Christchurch massacre. But it's one of those issues that world leaders, governments are very much minded to do something about, and yet we're not quite sure where they're going. It's interesting, Joan mentioned National Newspaper Awards. We won 10 a couple of weeks ago. The Toronto Star won 1. And what did they win it for? They won it for Daniel Dale's work in keeping score of all Trump's lies. That's what Daniel Dale does. He sits in front of a TV set or whatever and keeps count. And it's in the thousands, obviously. And that has become such a popular thing that CNN have now hired Daniel Dale to work for them. So he's leaving the Star, he's going to CNN, at least until the next election, I guess, to do exactly that. And Canadians want to keep track of that, even though they can't hold Trump to account at the ballot box. They still want to keep score of how many lies are being told on a daily basis. So, there's Daniel Dale off to do that work down south. Where do we go from there? We live, I think, as it's pretty clear, we live in a world where credibility matters more than ever. And yet criticism of media bias, alleged bias, has seldom been more prevalent. Led not least by the President of the United States, who frequently refers to journalists as the enemies of the people, often at his rallies. That's a tough challenge for an editor-in-chief or a publisher. Even the Globe, with a long history of editorial independence. And just let me stop there and say the Thompson family, who've owned the Globe since the late 70s, have a 3-generation commitment to protecting editorial independence. It's what they've believed in since Roy Thompson started it all back in the 1930s. He always said, to be properly independent, you've actually got to make money. Then you're not subject to commercial pressure. And they've stuck with that, and they do not interfere in the views or the content of the Globe and Mail. I've worked for all 3 of the Thompsons, Roy, Ken, and our current chairman, David Thompson. And that's been their practice throughout those 3 generations. It's a bedrock principle. Unlike some of the other owners that I've worked for, like Rupert Murdoch or Conrad Black, because when you work for them, you very clearly get a sense of what it is they want you to say and what it is they don't want you to say. That doesn't happen. So despite that independence, despite that long tradition, we are accused every day of twisting the news. Let me just give you an example. We broke the SNC Leveland story on February the 7th. It was pretty much on the front page for every day for about 2 months until people sort of really got tired of it, and our bureau chief in Ottawa went on holiday, and it tended to stop for a week. It dominated the news agenda for the whole of the media and for the country. It was very good for our subscription business. But throughout that period, there was an element of our very smart audience, our very smart readership, who were accusing us all the time of saying, you're trying to topple Justin Trudeau. That's what your purpose is about. And our answer was to that, we report the news, we don't make it. We did not fire 2 cabinet ministers from the Liberal caucus. We did not tell Michael Wernick to resign as clerk of the Privy Council. We did not tell Jerry Butts that he had to resign. So those casualties happened because of how the government chose to manage a crisis, and we covered it. So, that's our position on that. It's an election year, and of course, politics are dominant and will continue to be so. We ain't seen nothing yet. I guess it's only May, and the election is months away, but it's interesting. Despite the criticism, what we saw was very much higher levels of subscription sales. People were coming to us because they expected us to have something that was different to what other people had. They could get insight, they could get commentary, they could get opinions they might not agree with, but they still wanted to hear those opinions. So that's what we're effectively selling on. That the business of subscriptions depends upon people's desire to have that insight, but they've got to have it with a sense of trust. They will not keep buying you if they doubt your integrity, if they think you are not being straight, if they think you've got a hidden agenda. So, it's the basis of our business. We have the best subscription business for any what you would call a traditional newspaper business in Canada. Others are trying to do it, like the Star. But as an example, the Globe has 110,000 digital subscribers, digital only. The Star has 15,000. That's the scale of the difference. We still have a lot of people who are very happily buying print subscriptions, another 120,000 of those. So subscriptions now make up a large chunk of our business. It's advertising used to be 70%, it's now 42% of our business. Subscriptions is by far the largest part of our revenue and profitability. And that's the future of the business, clearly. Digital subscriptions are growing at 20% plus a year. So that doesn't happen unless people have a belief that what you're giving them is credible, that it is not fake, it's not false. So let's get back to just talking about that, because it's one of the things that really bugs me in our industry, that we've got a lot of people turning a blind eye to the fakery, the falsehoods, to the lies that are going on in digital advertising, but also in turning a blind eye to the need for audits. It's very frustrating when you're sitting in a room full of publishers who are saying, well, we don't need to have audits anymore. Nobody asks for them. The advertisers are not interested in that. They don't need to see those numbers. Or we'll just produce our own numbers and somebody will rubber stamp those and they will be accepted as the numbers. So in our industry, there's lots of people just putting up their own numbers and saying, here they are. Trust us. Believe us. And apparently nobody's asking to validate that. So when I see the work that AAM is doing to say, okay, we can verify, we can validate the numbers, we can show you that those numbers are real, that they're not based on fake sites, fake non-existent human beings, that it's actually real, you wonder why more people are not saying, okay, I demand to see that. I won't spend the money until I see that. But there's a lot of turning a blind eye going on, and that's a problem within our industry that I think we all have to face up to. We're very, as Joan said, we talk about journalism that matters, journalism that makes a difference. It's why the Thompsons own us. They don't own us because we make a lot of money. The Thompsons, as a family, are worth $30 billion plus. The Thomson Reuters share price, take a look at it. It's $86. It used to be $28. They do pretty well off the back of Thomson Reuters. They're not waiting for the check from the Globe and Mail. They own the one remaining paper they've got is the Globe and Mail. They used to own hundreds. They used to own the Times of London. They used to own the Sunday Times. They used to own hundreds of papers in different parts of the world. Why do they do that? Because they believe that the Globe and Mail has the ability to make a difference for the better in Canada. They have that faith that journalism can actually move policymakers, can affect governments, can have a benefit. But that's based on trust. And that's what we've got to keep delivering. Why aren't we delivering it to the same degree when we're talking about advertising, measurement, when we're talking about delivery of what people are paying for and yet apparently paying for blindly? So that's my parting thought on that one.
That's great, thank you. And would you agree that quality, independent journalism requires an investment?
Absolutely. If you look across across Canada, most news. I started 21 years ago at the Globe, and most newspapers in Canada are very much worse than they used to be 21 years ago, because ownerships have not kept investing in the quality of the journalism. The Vancouver Sun, for instance, had a newsroom of 200 people back in 1999. It has less than 50 people dedicated to the Vancouver Sun. The total newsroom for the Sun and the province is about 80 people. The Ottawa Citizen used to be one of the best papers in Canada, nation's capital. Important to be able to read that. Number of journalists there, less than 50 now. The Globe has 260 journalists. It makes a difference. You've got to have expertise. You've got to have authority. You've got to have people who actually understand their beats. You've got to have people like Bob Fife in Ottawa, who's brilliantly well connected with the political scene there. So that's why it's possible for us to sell subscriptions, and it isn't possible for some of these guys to do it, because they've just starved the newsrooms of investment, because they're public companies. They're in difficulty. The Star share price is down under $1. In 2005, that was about $25. So the reduction, the Star used to have 400 journalists, it now has less than 150. So the quality of the journalism has suffered as the companies have struggled to maintain their share price and maintain their profitability. And that is just true in Canada, it's true in the USA, it's true in the UK. So this is a pretty serious problem. It's why the government, as you've seen over the last couple of years, has been wondering what it should do. What should we do to prop the industry up? And my advice to them is, don't prop failing businesses up. There are people who can actually find niches and succeed, but if you are all you're doing is trying to prop up failing businesses, I don't think that's a great policy. But there is no doubt a concern that there will be an increasing democratic deficit in this country as there is less scrutiny, and believe me, it happens all the time. If you see an area where there is poor scrutiny, bad things start to happen. We've put a couple of people into Thunder Bay. We've never had a bureau in Thunder Bay ever. But there was a report last year on Thunder Bay, very critical of both the mayor and the police, for, again, not doing anything about systemic racism within that community. Some very bad things happening, lots of missing people, and the report, independent report, was very critical. So what are we doing? We're putting some of our best people up there to see if it actually makes a difference, to shine a light on what's going on in that community and try and find some of the good things that are going on there to try and make a difference. Because, to be blunt, it's not happening. The local paper doesn't have the resources to do that. It's a very small newsroom now. It's a handful of people. So they don't have that ability. So we're seeing if it makes a difference, if the Globe and Mail shines a light, and I'll tell you at the end of this year. I don't know. I can't guarantee that.
Okay, thank you. So we're hearing that there is investment in certain areas. There is quality journalism out there, independent journalism. Yet there's a real breakdown in trust. There's breakdown in trust in different areas. Marketers are investing billions of dollars in digital marketing, over $6 billion in Canada. It's a big number. And in the US, just eclipsed $100 billion and more than $330 billion worldwide. But what we're hearing, and we've heard today even, that results in many cases are not being seen. Why is this? It seems we've been talking about digital ad fraud for many, many years. Angie, can you put that slide up? When you look at this, the overall estimates of fraud vary wildly, but even the most conservative estimates put money involved worldwide well into the billions annually. Recent estimates vary from $6.5 billion to as high as $19 billion. We've even heard $60 billion. No one can really get their finger on the number, but let's face it, it's a big number regardless if it's $6 billion or $19 billion. So a range that points to the difficulty in measuring fraud's true impact. So the industry has lost billions of dollars annually like this, and these estimates, are out there. Why is it? Ted, maybe you can give us some insights of how we got here.
Thank you. I think and Maura did quite a good job summarizing this, so I'll be brief. But in Internet 1.0, perhaps Yahoo represented that most best in terms of the kind of early banner ad inventory that was available, and that rapidly gave way to Internet 2.0, which was about blogs and the long tail. Again, Maura referenced Chris Anderson's book, which is an excellent book, and I think probably has been proved fatally wrong in the sense that all these audiences were aggregated by ad exchanges, which came into play as a result of these opportunities to aggregate audiences. And as a result of that, fraudsters were able to penetrate the ecosystem and start to plug into DSPs or SSPs, probably SSPs more than DSPs, and really start to game the system. And this whole notion of buying audience versus buying environments has really at the root of why we are where we are today. Because if you're buying audience of any kind from anybody, and if one searches internet audience traffic, you'll pull up 10 or 15 or 20 minimum organizations from which you can buy traffic. Males 25-54, females 18-34, and if you buy that traffic, you are almost certainly buying bot traffic. And I don't mean B-O-U-G-H-T, I mean B-O-T. It's one of the ironies of the English language. But that is certainly true, and that's how we got here. And to conclude that question, Joan, I would say that we absolutely support all the things that Maura talked about earlier. The IAB lab is doing really well in the U.S. With all kinds of initiatives. Canada's IAB team is working very, very hard. RTB 3.0, all the initiatives, TAG, all wonderful. The foundationally missing piece is a publisher audit. A publisher audit is the last best step before the inventory moves toward the advertiser. So imagine if you have, for lack of a better word, corrupt inventory that is being sold by a publisher. In many cases, it's unwittingly, because not everybody knows that traffic is being bought in an organization, but at times it is not unwittingly. But if that is happening, your viewability numbers, all your core metrics are out the window. And that's where the problem really begins and ends now. All those other initiatives are hugely important to tightening up the ecosystem. The big leak right now is coming from publishers. And we need a publisher audit protocol broadly across the North American spectrum, indeed globally, in order for the fraud that's currently occurring to really start to be meaningfully reduced.
Thanks, Ted. Angie, can you put up the next slide? So this quote comes from Matt Green, the global lead for media and digital for the World Federation of Advertisers. The number of advertisers curating their own media sellers have been growing for the last 3 years. The fraud issues in 2015, the rise of ad verification firms a year later, followed by the shift from blacklisting to whitelisting in 2017, has pushed advertisers further away from the long tail of dodgy domains. Do you agree with this? Okay.
Go ahead.
Phillip?
I do. I really do believe that whitelisting makes a huge difference, but in order to justify a whitelist, one really needs to understand what the quality of the inventory is. Quality of audience, quality of journalism, quality of inventory are inextricably linked. Triple pillars, if you will, of that principle. Go ahead, Phillip.
So it's ironic that, as a business, the Globe knows far more about its audience than it's done ever. In the last 3 years, we've had pretty much a revolution in the business because of the impact of data science. We've developed our own data analytics, predictive tools. So we are very much better at knowing what our audiences are doing, how they're interacting with our content. And that is a constant conversation with our own journalists, as well as with our readers. And yet we seem to have this missing link where we, in my view, do not have enough people demanding data that they can really put their faith in and trust to support the advertising spend. It is remarkable how that's to me, the missing bit, the missing link in this chain. And to Ted's point, I think it is very much better than it was, and yet where there is this expectation that you have all this information, all this data, delivered instantly. If you walk around the Globe and Mail offices now that we moved into a couple of years ago, there are screens all over those offices which are telling you within 10 minutes how every piece of content is being consumed. And whether it's converting subscriptions, whether it's driving social media, we get very fast readout, but, our homepage is now effectively delivered by AI. We know enough about our audience now that we don't have to have journalists choosing which content gets presented. The machine does it for you because the machine is already well educated enough to know what will work best on that website. I think on the homepage of the Globe and Mail there's only 3 pieces every day that are touched by humans. And the journalists have bought into that because it actually supports what many of them would say, okay, that's my gut instinct, that's what I would have felt. And the data actually now gives them the confidence they can say, okay, I can sit back and watch this. The machine is doing it. So we've got all of that capability, and yet, to me, it's so damn frustrating that agencies, advertisers aren't saying, hang on, show me. Show me the proof. Show me that this is real, that this isn't a fake. You expect it with your news, you expect it in every other respect, and yet we're not doing it. And it's there. It's there to be got.
Okay, so ad fraud estimates vary, but there's no denying that the fraud is there, right? It has been. There's been some steps and some, good things happening. But so here's how I'm hearing things. Advertisers waste money on fake sites and fake traffic. Legitimate publishers compete with those fake sites for advertisers' dollars. Is it fair to say current industry solutions and technologies are helping, but we need more? Do we need more?
Yeah, that was the point I was making earlier, and there's a virtuous circle that really should be occurring that has not occurred yet, and that is that with every dollar of fraud that's in the ecosystem, less money is available for quality journalism. So CPMs have fallen through the floor. In some cases we talked about, I think Maura mentioned this as well, 40 to 60% of the dollars not making it through to publishers. So that's just an unacceptable situation. Theoretically, if you had an ecosystem that had publisher audits, in addition to all the other things that other players in the ecosystem, leaders in the ecosystem are doing, CPMs start to reinflate. You close the ecosystem and CPMs start to reinflate. That is not a dream that is not worth having. That is a dream that is worth thinking about as an industry. And it is possible to make that happen, but we have to stop the leakage. And that's really, I think, the situation we find ourselves in. Phillip, do you want to comment on that?
We deal a lot. Inevitably, if you're a leading Canadian player, you inevitably have to spend time talking to the Googles, the Facebooks, the Apples, the Amazons, and there is a considerable difference in terms of how those platforms are responding to this kind of conversation. Google are very much more, I think, smart in how they handle this, because Facebook has not handled the pressure well. Zuckerberg and Sandberg have not looked good over the last 2 years, as they've looked evasive, as they will only do things when they're forced into doing something by heavy public pressure, responding to events. Google is smarter at saying, okay, we'll work with you. They still get fined $5 billion by the EU or whatever, but they've worked with us, the newspaper industry, the Globe, on the Trust Project. That was an initiative that Google kicked off a few years ago and said, we can build our algorithms which will reward information that you can have some trust in. So how do you define trust, and what does an algorithm look like when it's trying to define trust? So they've added authority to what they would call as relevance. And allegedly now they are building their algorithms based on that, so that it will reward, from a search point of view, publishers who have a record of both authority and relevance. In other words, you can trust them. There's something like 200 newspapers around the world now involved in that project. So we'll see where that goes. Apple just launched into Canada with its new subscription product. They wanted us to be their partners. We said no. And the reason I said no is lack of trust. I cannot trust Apple when they tell me, we do not retain your data. We do not retain your data. Oh, yeah? Okay. I've seen how iPhones work. But they will tell you how your content is being consumed, in the sense that you put stories up. They will pay you for how long somebody spends on that piece of content. So whether it's 10 seconds, 2 minutes, 20 minutes, they will pay you depending on that. But they won't tell you who the customer is. And from my point of view, I can't work with a company that will not tell me who the customer is for that piece of content, because that's the basis of our business. It's understanding our audience. And by the way, there's not much money in that. Andrew Saunders, who's our Chief Revenue Officer, who would have been here today, but he's currently in New York talking to our programmatic partners who we represent in Canada, people like Reuters and Washington Post and Forbes and Wall Street Journal, people like that. He talked to Hearst on Monday, and I don't know whether this is confidential or not, but Hearst told him the amount of advertising revenue they're making out of the Apple subscription proposition so far runs between $10,000 to $20,000 a month. That's all. It's absolute chicken feed. So, this is very early days. It's only been running for a couple of months. Apple Spotlight is still very effective in projecting traffic, but just don't expect too much money from it. So today, one of the most popular stories on the Globe site was a Spotlight story that Apple projected about the Prime Minister dodging out of the Commons yesterday rather than saying sorry to Admiral Norman. That, because it was projected by Apple, got huge traffic. That doesn't bring us anything other than traffic numbers. It doesn't convert into dollars. Amazon, different conversation. We're partners with the Washington Post. Amazon, as you know, is the sister company. Jeff Bezos owns Amazon. He owns the Washington Post. And they are talking to us about improvements in our technology, particularly on voice, that will make a big difference. We've not had this kind of partnership with them. We use them for cloud. We trust them. We have a lot of faith in their integrity as a business. We have a faith in their principles because we've seen it work out with the Washington Post, so we have a level of comfort in that relationship. But I can't trust Apple when they tell me I don't retain the data. I believe they are retaining the data, and they're just not willing to tell you that. They know who your customers are. And in 2 years' time, they can say, thanks very much, we're off, we don't need any of you, thank you, we've got it.
Yeah, I like the conversation around trust. Trust is a very complex term in the context of the conversation today. We have our colleague Fiona Conway here from the Radio and Television News Directors Association, of which she is the president, and Ipsos on their behalf did some research last week, and I think the good news is that people in this country are turning more than ever toward traditional sources, what we call traditional sources of news, because they're trustworthy. That would not necessarily be the case for millennials, but in the context of trust, people are getting very, from a consumer news point of view, people are very skeptical of some of the FANGs, if you will, which Phillip was just talking about, and sources that are not trusted, and journalists that are not trusted and invested in. And you know, there is very much kind of a chain effect, if you will, around that issue. So while it's good news that Canadians are trusting traditional news sources more frequently and better, it's really troubling that we don't have the infrastructure and the dollars to support that trust when it comes to investment in journalism. And Canada is not the United States. I mean, we, as everyone in this room knows, fight our own battles every day, but we have to invest in our own ecosystem, and that is simply not happening in the multiples that it needs to for a sustained business news operation across any of the smaller communities in particular in this country. This is an American example, but I will speak to it because it's representative of what's happening here as well. NPR ran a piece a few months ago on municipalities in the United States who didn't have an independent, fact-based, accountability-based news organization, newspapers in the particular case I'm talking about. They assign, so lenders who are considering lending to these municipalities for infrastructure projects or whatever it is, assign a minimum 4-point risk premium to anybody that doesn't have an independent, fact-based news association in their community. Because they know, to Philip's earlier point, corruption begins at the municipal level and creeps its way up into federal public life. And so we are threatened as a democratic society, most fundamentally, if we do not get this sorted out.
Thank you. Before we move on, are there any questions or observations from the audience?
Derek.
Oh, sorry.
I read a book in early 2000s from Clay Shirky, Dr. Clay Shirky. It was called Here Comes Everybody. And he spoke to that exact point long before it happened. So he said, here's the danger of where we're heading. And boy, did he call it. Because we're seeing those municipalities, courts not being covered, and the corruption starting. And I can't think it's not going to spread. And, you know, God bless products like the Globe and Mail with their credibility and the journalism you're at least watching. And your example on Thunder Bay was an exceptional one. I actually have a personal friend who's considering retiring very early from the police force because of what's going on. She has too much integrity to be working for that police force.
Wow.
So thank you for that.
Thanks, Derek. Melanie?
Just want to pick up on the point of like Phillip, you were mentioning about the government, the federal government tightening regulations around political advertising and stories that people have picked up on recently. But I'm also thinking about political advertorial companies who push onto Facebook under the guise of not-for-profits, like Ontario Proud, which is this advertorial wrapped in not-for-profit. What's the role that advocates play? What are the roles? Is there a role for publishers, people in the media landscape to address this problem or advocate at a policy level? Because we do have an upcoming election.
Yeah.
We know what happens in Brexit.
Okay. So in 2 weeks' time, we're announcing a partnership with ProPublica, which is an American-based organization which has been tracking political advertising, particularly in the U.S. We had a little partnership with them last year on the Ontario election. But, it is a major concern for the government here. Justin Trudeau has been down to California, has talked to Zuckerberg and said, do not interfere with the Canadian election in the way you allowed the interference in the last election that Trump got elected. So ProPublica have a tool that we will now use, which helps to track, if you like, the fake and phony ads, and will, do a daily tracking generally of what's happening. But a number of others obviously are staying away from it altogether. Google have pretty much said we're keeping out of this. They would just rather not have the risk. It's not worth it.
Some people aren't recognizing that the editorial skin that gets wrapped around the ads, they're not recognizing.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And some people only see what they want to see.
Great question, thanks. Anybody else before we're going to start wrapping up? Okay, so what we're hearing here is that all of these things require investment, right? And our democracy is based on this, to be honest. So if we thought about, and I'm going to steal a line that Craig Silverman says all the time, is that if we were to get rid of some of this fraud, as much as we could, and reinvested that back into the industry, what a different world we'd be living in. And this disruptive time that we're living in is kind of similar to over 100 years ago, eh, Ted? If you wanted to address a little bit about, we formerly were called the Audit Bureau of Circulations. We rebranded 10 years ago, Susan, something like that. We're now the Alliance for Audited Media, incorporating all of the digital and so on. But it's not that different from where we came from. And I'm just going to ask Ted to talk about that for a bit.
There were a lot of troubles in the newspaper business, in particular in the early part of the 20th century. 1914 kind of all came to a head. There was a fellow in Chicago named Max Annenberg who ran a newspaper called the Chicago American and basically sent around wagons with very large gentlemen who would enforce distribution rules, if you will. And there were many claims being made about circulation, newspapers winding up in the East River in Manhattan, and wild circulation claims being made. And the Association of American Advertisers, as the ANA was then known, in its wisdom, decided to set up an organization called the Audit Bureau of Circulations, which is our forebearer. And it was really a defensive mechanism, to Joan's earlier point, about trying not to get the government involved in regulation of the industry. And so it was set up as a tripartite organization, publishers, advertisers, and agencies. And essentially, for the past 106 years, it has built and sort of run as a currency circulation audits. And I think Mark Twain is attributed to have once said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And there are so many similarities in this current context to that time. It's really, I think, encouraging to know that there's a model that exists that can really sort this out. And the one sort of analogous piece is publisher audits that I think, as I said earlier, remain the kind of final foundation of what it'll take to squeeze and to continue to squeeze fraud out of the system.
Okay, thanks, Ted. So is it, Phillip, is it a fair assumption that traditional publishers who have either extended into digital distribution or digital properties are more careful in terms of what they allow? Would we have a healthier ecosystem if there was more investment in traditional publishers on the digital front?
Well, I think they feel so frequently that they're powerless because the gigantic companies carry so much more weight and influence that whatever they do, it makes a little difference. You've got to start with addressing some of the what some of the largest advertisers are capable of doing with their influence in talking to the platforms, and ultimately that hasn't worked either. So it's now at the level of what governments are saying, whether it's the EU, whether it's the British government. The Canadian government is being criticized for inaction, for standing on the sidelines and waiting for other people to make some tough calls. So it's escalated up to that level, and potentially you could see Facebook and Google being broken up as some of the early capitalist companies were in the U.S. Trusts, because they're too big. It may end in that, but whether that changes the model from an advertising point of view, I couldn't say. I think there's a lot of water to go under the bridge yet.
Okay, thank you. So trust is becoming more important. We've, in many areas, consumer and the media and marketers, what we were talking about here, the fraud front, and marketers and consumers on the privacy side of things. Trust is everything, really. So if we were to bring trust back into the world we live in, it would be a different media business that we currently have. How do we do that? Who plays a part in that? We are a tripartite organization that is marketers, advertising agencies, and publishers. Is it all of us that need to come together and do this?
I mean, I'll start because I think we do, but I also believe that the advertiser pays the freight. So from that perspective, notwithstanding Phillip's circulation numbers going up and advertising dollars going down in relative terms, advertisers have to take a leading role. Advertisers have to follow their money. It's their money. And if they follow their money, they will wind up in a better situation than they are in cases where they don't. I think everybody has to work together, as I guess the AM example exhibits over the past 100 years plus. But advertisers are at the forefront of trying to hold the system to account. And I don't think it's about CPMs in terms of cost. Cost is what you pay, value is what you get. And I think we really have to think through as an industry what that means, what trust means. And as Ronald Reagan once said, trust but verify. I mean, it's one thing to take your money and give it to someone to go publisher direct, and not to see it disappear into an exchange. Not that anybody has ill intent in that construct. It's simply that it's not properly managed in today's world the way it needs to be for complete and utter transparency and trust. And that would be my argument.
Yeah, so simple answer: hit them in the pocket and then they'll start to do something.
Okay. So, critical time for the future of digital media. We already touched on it. Had a good discussion here. We're going to open the floor to more questions. Do we have time, Derek? What time are we at? Okay. And see if, we can come together and find a way to move this forward. Any more?
I just want to make a comment just about, advertisers following the money and currently maybe turning a blind eye. I think one of the problems is that it's easy to say it's somebody else's problem. Joan, you talk about is it $1 billion problem? It just seems so big, and that's the whole wide world. Is that really me? And I looked at the ANA, the Association of Advertisers, did a study with White Ops in 2017. And so they found an average of 6.4% fraud in the campaigns that they audited. And then I looked at the IAB reported revenue report and looked at the digital and video spend in Canada for that year, 2017. And just taking those two numbers, the estimate for fraud, advertisers' dollars lost to fraud in Canada in 2016 is $155 million. $155 million. So I think part of it is really bringing it home to, what are you losing out on, and where better could that money
Be spent, yeah.
I think that's a great point, Maura. Thank you.
To the question about the effects of this on democracy, has anyone looked at or investigated those huge sums of money, billions worldwide? Is that like some kid funding their university expenses by running these various bots? Or is it organized crime? Are they state actors? Who is actually getting that money? That's a lot of money. If you defund that, wouldn't you have a huge effect on basically the planet?
It's a major criminal activity, basically. Okay, there are kids in basements, but we have to spend an increasing amount of money every year now just to protect ourselves from the constant assaults. It's non-stop every day on our systems. As a newspaper, it's what comes with the territory. It's mainly coming from Eastern Europe. It's from China, Bulgaria, and it's the cost goes up every year, and just protecting ourselves against being misused, abused, sometimes without our knowledge. But now we're at the point where it's clear what's happening every day, and it's part of protecting the integrity of the business. But these companies are major criminal enterprises. Let's not sort of underestimate. This isn't just amateur night stuff. This is people making lots of money.
I would concur. I mean, based on my understanding, that's exactly the situation we face.
Anybody else? Okay, so just to finish up here, AAM has a new program. We're touched on it a bit. We've been in beta R&D for over 3 years on this. It's a three-pronged approach: quality certification, which will be launching this summer in full force. So you'll hear more about it, and we'd love to talk to you about it in greater detail. We thank you for your attention today and for keeping this top of mind, because it's very important for our industry moving forward. Thank you,
Thank you
Phillip.
very much.
Thank you, Ted.
Thank you, Joan.